Most people have no idea what really happened during the Dust Bowl. Families were buried alive, literally. The sky turned black, entire towns vanished. But what caused it wasn't just nature, and what they did to survive will shock you. This isn't just a story about wind and dirt. It's about desperation, survival, and the collapse of the American dream. In this video, you're going to see what life was really like in the Dust Bowl, the forgotten terror of the 1930s Midwest. And by the end, you might start to wonder, is it happening again today? Stay with us. This story has twists that history books tend to leave out. It all started with a dream called the American West. Open land, clean air, rows of golden wheat as far as the eye could see. In the early 1900s, thousands of families packed up their lives and headed west. Kansas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, Texas, Colorado. The government said, claim your land, work the soil, build the future, and people did. They risked everything to own 160 acres of prairie, and for a while, it worked. The 1920s were booming. The wheat industry exploded. Farmers bought tractors, built homes, sent their kids to new schools. These were towns baptized with optimism. They believed in progress because progress was all around them. But there was a problem hiding just beneath their feet. Farmers, encouraged by government incentives and skyrocketing prices, were tearing apart land that had never been plowed before. Native prairie grasses that had held the soil down for thousands of years, were ripped out. By 1930, nearly every inch of land was under a plow. And then, everything changed. The rain stopped. At first, it was just a bad year. Then, another. And another after that. The Great Depression had already slammed Wall Street by 1929. Banks were collapsing, jobs were vanishing. But on the plains, something else was brewing. The farms, they weren't failing because of money. They were failing because the sky stopped delivering. By 1931, crops were withering in the field. Livestock were starving, and with no vegetation, the soil just sat there, loose, dry, waiting. And then came the wind. Small at first, some grit in the air, a little thicker than usual. But the storms grew bolder, bigger, darker, deadlier. Daylight would vanish in seconds. Chickens suffocated with their eyes open. Cars stalled in the street because the engines choked on dirt. These weren't just windstorms. They were continental-sized nightmares. One later became known as Black Sunday, and you'll see why soon. But back then, they thought it would pass. They were wrong. Most people don't realize how unprepared the world was. Rural families had no clue how to deal with this. Kids went to bed with wet washcloths over their faces to keep from choking. Parents sealed windows with wet rags and newspapers. Still, they'd wake up to find fine dirt coating their kitchen table, their beds, and even their lungs. Dust pneumonia spread. Hospitals filled with coughing children. Some were buried in the very soil that killed them. One nurse wrote in her diary, "It's like watching someone drown in air." Winds would peel the paint of houses. Static from the dry storm would spark between doorknobs. And yet, people stayed. Because where else could they go? They owned nothing. Their land was worthless. Banks had repossessed farms. And try to imagine this for just a second. You go outside and all you see is dirt, sky, and silence. You walk through a town and it smells like a barn because livestock are rotting where they collapsed. No one has the strength or money to bury them anymore. The truth is, it wasn't just the weather, it was us. You see, the Dust Bowl wasn't a natural disaster. Not really. It was manufactured by human hands and ignorance. In fact, the US government had encouraged farmers to tear up millions of acres of native prairie grass. That grass had roots that went 10 feet deep, anchoring the soil for centuries. Once removed, the dry earth was no match for drought or wind. Worse still, during World War I, wheat prices had soared, so farmers planted more, tilled more, destroyed more. And by the time the crash came, the earth was exposed, stripped, vulnerable. We had built an empire on topsoil, and then we erased it. By 1933, everything collapsed. The crops were gone, so were the jobs, and many towns became graveyards of human effort. But not everyone stayed. Over 2.5 million people packed up and left. Whole families driving old Fords piled high with mattresses, wagons, chickens, bags of flour. They followed Route 66 west toward California. They were nicknamed Okies. Whether they were from Oklahoma or not, they hoped for jobs, fresh starts. That hope was met with hatred. Farmers in California saw them as invaders. Wages dropped. Families were crammed into tent cities, living among mosquitoes, mud, and violence. One refugee said, "I lost more men in a labor camp fight than I saw die during the storms." But here's the twist. Some families didn't leave. They stayed behind in boarded up houses trying to outlast the dirt. And their stories, that's where it gets even more heartbreaking. There's one story of a young woman, 8 months pregnant, giving birth while her husband desperately tried to keep the house sealed during a black blizzard. The baby came early in a room full of flying dirt. The child survived, but its lungs were weakened forever. April 14, 1935. The day that marked the lowest point in Dust Bowl history. It began as a calm Sunday afternoon. For once, children in the towns were playing outside. Adults were gardening. Some were picnicking. But at 4 p.m., the horizon turned black. Faster than a train, taller than a skyscraper, a 1,500-mile-wide wall of dirt hurled toward them. People ran screaming. Birds plunged from the sky. Chickens suffocated right in their coops. The storm hit, and everything disappeared. Cattle died where they stood. Drivers crashed into ditches. Thousands of homes were damaged. Tons of topsoil gone. Some called it the day America's illusion of invincibility truly ended. Others just called it hell. His name was Hugh Hammond Bennett, a quiet soil scientist, soft-spoken, overlooked. But he'd been warning Washington for years. He said if we didn't change our farming habits, we'd lose the land. No one listened until Black Sunday. Dust from the plains blew all the way to Washington, D.C., where Bennett was giving testimony. When lawmakers saw the dirt swirling around the Capitol, they acted. And that changed everything. The government finally invested in conservation. They taught farmers about crop rotation, planted trees to act as windbreaks, paid families to stop tearing up the land. Slowly, the land started to recover, but it took years, and some places never recovered at all. Earlier, we asked, What if it's happening again? Right now, some scientists say we're in the early stages of a second Dust Bowl. Over farming, monoculture cereal crops, climate change. In places like Kansas and Arizona, aquifers are drying up, droughts are growing longer, and topsoil is eroding at record speeds. Sound familiar? The tools are more advanced, but the risks might be even bigger this time. History, it seems, has a dusty way of repeating itself. You might think the Dust Bowl ended in the 1940s, but traces of it remain in American lungs. Studies show older survivors still carry scar tissue, not just in their bodies, but in their memories. They remember coughing blood, seeing their neighbors walk into a storm and never come back, living every day in shades of brown and gray. So why should we care now? Because the Dust Bowl wasn't just about weather. It was about short-term thinking. It was about ignoring nature's balance, prioritizing profit over prudence, and failing to act until it was too late. But it also showed something else, something worth holding on to: resilience. The people who stayed and those who fled didn't give up. They didn't have savings, education, or resources, but they had grit. If they survived, maybe we can too, but only if we pay attention this time. What would you have done if you'd lived through the Dust Bowl? Comment below and hit like if this moved you.